daughter changed the locks on the house I built with my own hands while I was sitting in the hospital chapel praying for her mother. I found out when I came home that evening and my key wouldn't turn. That same night, I made one phone call, and everything she thought she owned started to disappear. My name is Lloyd Mercer. I am 67 years old, and I live in Kelowna, British Columbia. I spent 34 years building a small empire out of nothing, a lumber supply business that grew from a single truck and a handshake reputation into a company that supplied half the construction projects in the Okanagan Valley. I did not inherit it. I did not get a loan from a wealthy father. I built it the way you build anything in this country, slowly, stubbornly, and with a woman beside you who believed in you even when the bank did not. Her name was Frances. We met in the autumn of 1987 at a community supper in Penticton. She was volunteering in the kitchen, and she handed me a bowl of chili and said, without looking up, "Don't tell me you came here just for the free food." I told her I came for the company. She finally looked up. That was it for me. We were married 11 months later in a small ceremony at her parents' church. No fancy venue, no destination wedding. Her father gave a toast that lasted 4 minutes and made everyone cry. I wore a rented suit. Frances wore her grandmother's veil. It was the best day of my life, until the day our daughter was born, and then that became the best day, and Frances and I argued about it gently for years after. Our daughter, Stephanie, she came into the world screaming in the summer of 1989, and she did not stop being loud about everything she wanted until she was about 35, when she learned to go quiet instead. Quiet is more dangerous. I know that now. The business grew because Frances ran the office and I ran the yards. We split the work without ever sitting down to discuss it. It just happened naturally, the way good marriages work. She handled the accounts, the payroll, the supplier contracts, the government filings. I handled the clients, the drivers, the inventory, the bids. We worked out of a converted garage until 1998, when we moved into a proper building on Industrial Avenue. Frances picked out the flooring. She said if she was going to spend 12 hours a day somewhere, it was going to have decent floors. Stephanie grew up watching us work. She rode in the delivery truck with me on Saturdays when she was small, sitting in the passenger seat, eating a Tim Hortons bagel, asking me questions about every building we passed. Who built that? How many boards did it take? Can I drive? She was 6. She could not drive. But I loved that she asked. She was smart. Really smart. I do not say that the way every father says it. I say it because she actually was, and because for a long time I thought that intelligence would save her from certain mistakes. I was wrong. Smart people make the worst mistakes because they can always find a reason to justify them. She went to UBC for business. Frances and I paid for everything: tuition, residence, books, the laptop, the flights home for Christmas. We never talked about it as a debt or an investment. She was our daughter. That was the whole reason. It was in her 3rd year that she met him. His name was Tanner Voss. His family had money, the kind of money that announces itself in how someone carries themselves, in the way they look at your house and glance at the baseboards. He came from West Vancouver. His father sat on the board of 2 resource companies. From the first dinner Stephanie brought him home for, Frances whispered to me in the kitchen, "That young man has never been told no in his life." I told her she was being unfair. She told me I was being a father. She was right. Again, as usual. They got engaged in 2015. The ring cost more than my first truck. Stephanie called us from Vancouver, excited in the way that you are excited when you are 26 and in love and have not yet understood that love is not the hardest part. The wedding was in 2016 at a vineyard in the South Okanagan. Tanner's parents wanted a venue on Vancouver Island. Frances and I said we would like it in the valley if possible, since most of our people were here. There was a brief negotiation. It ended with the vineyard. Frances and I wrote a check for $62,000. Tanner's parents contributed what they called the rehearsal dinner and the honeymoon, which was a trip to Portugal. I shook Tanner's father's hand at the reception, and he said, "You've got a remarkable daughter." I said, "I know." He said it like he was complimenting a product. I noticed that. The years after the wedding were fine on the surface. Stephanie and Tanner settled in Kelowna, which surprised us. I had assumed they would stay in Vancouver, but Tanner had decided he wanted to get into real estate development in the interior, and Stephanie began working with me more seriously, learning the business from the inside. I was glad to have her. More than glad. I started thinking, quietly, about what succession might look like. I started imagining handing something over that would last. The first sign that something was shifting came in 2020. Tanner had partnered with a developer on a condo project in West Kelowna, and the project was struggling. He came to me, through Stephanie, asking if Mercer Lumber could offer extended payment terms on materials. I agreed, because he was family and because the amount was not ruinous. But when the project finished, and I asked about settling the account, Stephanie told me Tanner felt the terms had been more of a gift than a loan. I let it go. I should not have. Frances noticed the change before I admitted it to myself. She told me one evening in February 2021, sitting at the kitchen table with her tea going cold, that Stephanie had started looking at us differently. Not with contempt exactly, but with a kind of measuring quality. Like she was assessing what was hers and what she would have to wait for. I told Frances she was tired. She told me to pay attention. The diagnosis came in March 2022. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3. The oncologist at Kelowna General was kind and direct. She gave us a range. Months, perhaps a year with aggressive treatment. Frances held my hand through the whole appointment. And when we walked out into the parking lot, she said, "Well, I suppose we'd better get organized." That was Frances. She did not collapse. She organized. I called Stephanie that evening. She cried. She said she would come over that weekend. She did come, that Saturday with Tanner, and they stayed for 3 hours. It was Tanner who suggested, over coffee, that this might be a good time to start thinking about the transition of the business. Frances heard it from the kitchen. She came out and set a plate of shortbread on the table and said, very pleasantly, "There's plenty of time for that." The subject was dropped. But it had been raised. The months that followed were the hardest and most sacred of my life. I gave everything I had to Frances. Every morning, every appointment, every bad night when the medication made her sick and she could not sleep. I took a leave from the business and handed day-to-day operations to my operations manager, a man I had trusted for 16 years named Phil Garrett. Stephanie was supposed to be taking on more responsibility. She was there, physically, some of the time. But there were weeks when we would not see her. Tanner had a new project. There were commitments. There were always commitments. Frances asked for her near the end, not in an accusatory way. Frances never asked for things with an edge. She just said one afternoon in November, lying in the hospital bed we'd set up in the living room, "I'd like to see Stephanie." Not for anything particular, just to see her. I called. Stephanie came 2 days later. She sat with Frances for 40 minutes. I stayed in the kitchen. "I don't know everything," they said. When Stephanie left, she hugged me in the hallway and said, "She seems okay." Frances was not okay. She was dying. I didn't say that. Frances died on the 14th of January, 2023. I was beside her. I had been awake for 31 hours. When it was over, I sat with her for a long time before I called anyone. Then I called Stephanie. Then I called Phil. Then I called my brother in Calgary. In that order, Stephanie arrived within the hour, and she was genuinely broken, I believe that. Whatever had grown cold in her toward me had not reached her love for her mother. She sat on the couch and could not speak for a long time. Tanner rubbed her back. He had his phone on the cushion beside him. The week after the funeral was when things began to move. I noticed small things first. A conversation between Stephanie and Tanner that stopped when I walked into the room. A call from my accountant saying Stephanie had requested a full financial summary of Mercer Lumber's assets. A visit from a lawyer I had never met, a man named Blaine Hooper, who arrived at the house 4 days after we buried Frances and introduced himself as the family's legal advisor on estate matters. I had never hired him. I asked Stephanie about it. She said Tanner had found him. She said it would be good to have someone coordinating things. 2 weeks after the funeral, Stephanie asked me to come to the office for a meeting. She said she wanted to discuss the future of the business. I went. I sat in the chair across from the desk that had been mine for 20 years. Blaine Hooper was there with a briefcase. Tanner was there, standing near the window, looking at his phone. Stephanie told me that she and Tanner had been thinking carefully about the company's direction, that the lumber supply model was legacy infrastructure, and the real growth was in development and project management. That she wanted to steer Mercer Lumber toward becoming a holding company for their real estate interests. She used language she had not used a year ago. She spoke about asset restructuring and generational transfer and reducing exposure. Tanner nodded at all of it. Hooper pushed a folder across the desk. He explained with the practiced warmth of someone who does this often that the documents inside would facilitate a smooth transition of operational authority, that it was standard practice in family business succession, that it would protect the company from probate complications related to Francis's estate. He said the word protect 4 times. I counted. I asked if I could take the documents home to review them. Stephanie said, of course, but added that there were some time-sensitive elements, a development partnership that required proof of ownership structure within the next 10 days. I nodded. I took the folder. That night I sat at the kitchen table where Francis and I had done our accounts for 30 years, and I read every page. I understood most of it. What I understood was that signing would transfer operational and financial authority over the primary business entity to Stephanie, with Tanner named as co-director. My role would become advisory. My salary would become a consulting stipend of $3,000 per month. The company Francis and I had built, which a business valuator had assessed at $4.2 million 2 years prior, would effectively no longer be mine. I did not sign. The next morning, I called the only lawyer I had ever trusted with anything that mattered. A woman in downtown Kelowna named Audrey Cheng, who had helped Francis and me draft our wills and our shareholder agreements 14 years earlier. I read her the documents over the phone. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Lloyd, do not sign anything. Come see me this week." I went the next day. What Audrey helped me understand, slowly and carefully over 2 meetings, was that the document Hooper had prepared was not a transition plan. It was a full transfer. The advisory role had no legal protection. The consulting stipend could be revoked at any time. There was a clause, buried in Schedule C, that would have given Stephanie and Tanner the authority to sell the company's primary assets without my consent. Audrey said, "If you had signed this, you would have owned nothing but the name on the door." I asked her what I should do. She told me to let her handle it. What Stephanie and Tanner did not know, what I had not told anyone except Francis and Audrey, was that 14 years ago, Francis and I had made a decision that felt, at the time, like excessive caution. Francis had insisted on it. She had read something about family business disputes, and she had come to me one Sunday morning with that look she got when she had already decided something, and was now informing me of her decision. She said we needed to put a significant portion of our assets into a structure that was separate from the operating company, a family trust managed by Audrey, with Francis and me as beneficiaries during our lifetimes. She said, "I hope we never need it, but I want it there." We had done it quietly. The trust held the property on Industrial Avenue, the building the business operated from, which we owned outright. It held 2 rental properties in West Kelowna. It held a portfolio of provincial bonds and dividend stocks that had grown by January 2023 to just over $2 million. The operating company, Mercer Lumber, paid rent to the trust for the use of the building. Stephanie, who had worked in the business for years, had no idea the building was not owned by the company. It appeared as a line item on the lease schedule. No one looks at lease schedules unless they are looking for something. Audrey called Blaine Hooper. She explained that any transaction involving the operating company would require a renegotiation of the building lease with the trust, which she administered, and that as trustee she was not in a position to approve such terms on the proposed timeline. She also sent a formal letter noting several irregularities in the succession documents that would require legal clarification before any signing could proceed. Hooper called me directly, once, to say there must be a misunderstanding. I told him to contact Audrey. 3 days later, Stephanie came to the house. Not with Tanner. Alone, which was unusual. She sat across from me in the living room, Francis's living room, still smelling faintly of the candles Francis liked. And she told me that I was making things difficult, that she was only trying to protect what her mother had built, that I was being emotional because of grief, and that Hooper was simply trying to help. I asked her one question. I asked her why she had changed the locks on the house. She hadn't expected that. I saw it on her face, 2 weeks after Francis died. While I had been staying with my brother in Calgary for a few days at his insistence, Stephanie had arranged for a locksmith to come to the family home. My home. The house Francis and I had bought in 1994 and renovated twice. When I returned from Calgary and found my key did not work, I had stood at my own front door for a full minute before I understood what had happened. I called a locksmith myself that evening and had the locks changed back. I did not mention it to Stephanie. I saved the locksmith's invoice and the date. She said the locks had been changed for security because she was worried about the house being empty. I told her the house had not been empty. I had only been in Calgary for 4 nights, and she had a key, and she had not mentioned any concern about security at any point prior to me leaving or returning. She said she had been trying to help. I told her I understood. I did not tell her what I was planning. What happened over the next 4 months happened quietly, which is how real consequences usually arrive. Audrey's office sent formal notice to the operating company that the building lease would not be renewed under current terms, and that a market rate rent review had been initiated effective the next quarter. The new rate was significantly higher than what Mercer Lumber had been paying, because what Mercer Lumber had been paying had always been below market, a quiet subsidy Francis and I gave ourselves. At market rates, the company's margins looked very different on paper. The 2 development projects Tanner had used the company's credit line to back, projects I had quietly guaranteed to the operating company without fully understanding what I was signing in the chaos of Francis's illness. Those guarantees were reviewed by Audrey and found to have procedural deficiencies. They could not be enforced without my explicit reauthorization. I did not reauthorize them. The credit line itself, which ran through a business account that still required my signature for changes above $50,000, was frozen pending a shareholder review that Audrey advised me to request. Without that credit line, Tanner's West Kelowna condo project, which he had told investors was fully financed, was not fully financed. I did not do any of this out of pure revenge, though I would be lying if I said there was nothing satisfying in the precision of it. I did it because Francis and I had spent 34 years building something real, and I was not prepared to let it be stripped away by a son-in-law who had never laid a 2x4 in his life, and a daughter who had learned to look at her parents' work as an inheritance rather than a gift. Stephanie called me in April. Her voice had a quality I had not heard since she was a teenager and had broken something expensive and knew she had to confess. She said she needed to talk. I said she could come to the house. She came without Tanner. Again, she sat in the kitchen, and she was honest in a way she had not been since before the wedding, I think. She told me she knew things had gone wrong. She told me Tanner's projects were in serious trouble and that they were frightened. She told me she had let him push her in directions she was not comfortable with, and that she was sorry for the locks, and for Hooper, and for the meeting at the office. She cried. Real tears, not performance. I know the difference with her. I have known her since she weighed 8 pounds and 3 ounces. I let her cry. I did not comfort her immediately, because some things need to be felt fully before they can be learned. Then I told her the truth about the trust, about what Francis had built, about why. I told her that her mother had loved her completely, and had also seen clearly, and that those 2 things are not in contradiction. I told her that Francis had spent months during her illness writing letters, to me, to Stephanie, to a few people she loved, and that in her letter to Stephanie she had said, "The only thing I ask is that you choose your father over your fear. He is worth more than anything we own." Stephanie asked me what I was going to do with the trust. I told her what Francis and I had always planned to do with it eventually, that a significant portion was already earmarked for the Francis Mercer Community Housing Fund, a project I was developing with a non-profit in Kelowna to build 12 affordable rental units for working families in the North End. That the building on Industrial Avenue would eventually be donated to the fund as well, once I was ready to step back, that what Frances and I had made was never only for us. I told Stephanie that I still wanted her in my life, that I still hoped to leave her something real, but that I needed to know she was choosing it for the right reasons, and that she was choosing me, not what I owned. She stayed for 4 hours that evening. We ordered food, and we talked the way we had not talked in years. At the end of the night, she asked if she could call me in the morning. I said yes. Tanner's condo project collapsed that spring. The investors withdrew. There were legal proceedings I will not detail. He and Stephanie separated in August. She called me when it happened, and she was not in pieces the way I expected. She was quiet, which I now know means she had been thinking about it for a while. She came back to Kelowna in September and asked if she could come back to Mercer Lumber properly, without Tanner involved, without Hooper, without any agenda except learning the business the right way. I said yes. Phil hired her back. I watched her in the first weeks, watched her actually looking at things she had skimmed past before. She started asking Phil questions about operations instead of just financials. She found the lease schedule and she called me and said, "Dad, the building." I said, "Yes." She said, "How long?" I said, 14 years. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Mom." I said, "Yes, always your mother." The Francis Mercer Community Housing Fund broke ground in March of this year. 12 units, ground floor, north end of Kelowna, close to the elementary school and the bus route and the grocery store that opened last year on Banks Road. Every unit has a small tile by the door, Frances's handwriting, reproduced from the note she left, that says, "Come in and feel at home." Stephanie was at the groundbreaking. She stood beside me in the mud in her good boots, because she had not thought to bring rain boots, and it was March in the Okanagan, and of course it rained. She didn't complain. She took photos on her phone, and she posted them with a caption that said, "My mother built this, one honest dollar at a time." 140 people liked it. I didn't tell her I cried reading it. She would have teased me about it, which is fine. That is what daughters are for. I am 67 years old. I lost the love of my life 14 months ago, and I am still learning to be in a house without her. Some mornings I still reach for my phone to tell her something small, the way the light is coming in, a news story she would have had an opinion about. Then I remember. That part does not get easier. Anyone who tells you grief gets easier is speaking loosely. What changes is you get stronger, and you learn to carry it differently. But I will tell you this. The morning after I called Audrey and set everything in motion, I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, and I looked out at the yard that Frances planted, and I felt, for the first time since she died, that I had not failed her, that I had done what she prepared me to do. She saw it coming before I did, as she always did, and she made sure I would be ready. Tanner chose money over family. My daughter nearly did the same, and then she chose differently. And I believe that choice cost her something real, and that the cost is what made it meaningful. I chose Frances, as I always had, even after she was gone. That is the only thing I know for certain. Everything else, the business, the trust, the fund, the 12 families who will move into those units before Christmas, all of it came from that one simple thing. 36 years of choosing the same person, over and over, in every small way, until it became the only way I knew how to live. I've thought a lot about what made Tanner believe he could walk into something 34 years in the making and simply take it. I think the answer is that he had never built anything. When you have never built anything, you do not understand what something costs. You see the finished structure and you calculate its market value, and you think, that could be mine. You do not feel the weight of the years inside the walls. Stephanie understood once. She rode in the truck with me on Saturdays when she was small. She watched her mother do the accounts at the kitchen table until 11 at night. She knew what Mercer lumber was made of because she had seen it being made. And then she spent enough years beside a man who looked at everything in terms of what it was worth to him, and slowly, without noticing, she started seeing the way he saw. That is the quiet danger of choosing who you spend your time with. You begin to think in their language. What I keep returning to is Frances. Not the Frances who was sick, though I carry that time with me every day. The Frances who sat across from me on a Sunday morning. 14 years ago and said we needed to protect what we had built, not from the world, but from the version of our daughter that had not yet appeared, but that she could already sense coming. That was not pessimism. That was the clearest kind of intelligence I have ever seen up close, the kind that does not flinch from what it sees, that does not dress an uncomfortable truth in softer clothing just because the truth involves someone you love. I did not have that clarity. I wanted to believe Stephanie was fine, that Tanner was harmless, that the signs Francis pointed out were just a worried mother reading too much into things. That is not wisdom. That is the thing we call hope when we are actually just avoiding a hard look at what is in front of us. Real wisdom, I think, is being willing to see clearly, even when what you see is going to cost you something. The thing about integrity is that it only means something when keeping it is inconvenient. It is easy to be honest when honesty costs you nothing. It is easy to be patient when you are not afraid. What Francis built, and I mean the trust, the structure, the quiet preparation, she built it out of a kind of moral seriousness that I did not fully appreciate until I needed it. She did not do it to punish Stephanie. She did it because she believed that protecting what is real is an act of love, even when the people you love cannot see it yet. Stephanie can see it now. I watch her in the office, asking Phil the questions she should have asked years ago, looking at the business the way you look at something you are trying to understand rather than something you are trying to acquire. That shift is not small. It cost her her marriage, her comfort, a version of herself she had been building for years. I do not take that lightly. I know what it takes to let go of a direction you have been moving in for a long time. What I would say to anyone who finds themselves where I was, standing at your own front door with a key that no longer works, trying to understand how you arrived at this moment, is this: the people who built something real always have more than the people trying to take it can see. Frances knew that. She made sure I would know it too, even after she was gone. That is the only inheritance that cannot be transferred without your consent. Not the money, not the property, not the company. The knowledge of what you are made of, and the quiet certainty that it is enough. Tanner never understood that. I hope eventually Stephanie does.